Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'm Tim Durling, got Matt Phillips with me.
Hey, guys.
And this is actually an episode that Matt had the concept for, so I'm going to throw it over to him in just a bit. But in a way, I think that a good starting point for this, because we're kind of picking up where this left off, is Martin Popoff's excellent big book of hair metal. And this, if you've never read this, it's an amazing book, probably out of print, might have to get a used copy, but you might look through this and the overall layout, you may think, Tim, this kind of looks like your unspooled book. This is definitely, we wanted something that kind of had this feel to it. Timeline, chronological order. This book famously charts the rise and fall of what is known as hair metal, not a favorite term of mine, but we all know what we mean when I say it. And it ends kind of with a dead stop in September 24th, 1991, which is when Nirvana's Nevermind was released. And at this point, I'm going to throw it over to Matt because Matt's going to lead us into the concept of this. What we're talking about is 6 years of solid rock starting in 1992, going to 1997, and in a time when the type of music that we're going to talk about was supposedly dead. So Matt, take it away.
Yeah, that's exactly it, Tim. I've always been of the opinion that they talked about when the grunge scene kind of came in. Now we think about, so some of the biggest grunge albums, and I own them, your Neverminds and your Tens and that sort of thing, they came out in 1991, but really didn't get going for the most part for most of those bands until 92. So we're talking about 92 to 97, when theoretically all the grunge bands were taking over. And, the stuff that we grew up listening to was set aside. But I mean, I went through my list of stuff and we've organized them by year. So our favorites from 92, our favorites from 93, 94, all the way through. And a lot of these records are actually some of my favorite records by these bands in a time when they were supposedly, put to the side. They were still being creative and writing some really good stuff. So.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's never overnight. These things it's always a process of, by the year. It's like, someone once said, it was like the extinction of the dinosaurs. It didn't end in just one crappy afternoon for the dinosaurs. Exactly. And my whole thing, and this is a time period where, I've done lots of discussions with people that are, older than we are, about what it was like when an album came out in 1981 or 1983. This is something I could speak to quite passionately because we lived through this period. We were going to NBCC in the midst of this. And, with me taking radio, like we were in the communication arts wing, which means we were inundated by this stuff. And you embraced the grunge stuff way more than I did. I'll admit I did have Pearl Jam 10 at one time. And I think I had Versus too. And I think I had Soundgarden, Super Unknown. But for the most part, I would stand firm to the bands that I listened to. And I never understood why a choice had to be made. And it may not have been the case, but it certainly felt like if somebody knew that you were still listening to the air bands, it's all of a sudden it felt very judgmental, like, okay, well, this person doesn't have anything useful to say. Look at what they listen to. It was really, it felt that way. And certainly in the mainstream, it felt that way. But yes, as we're about to find out, there was quality music being made. In some ways, maybe this era got some of the bands thinking about actually what they were writing about a little bit more. But certainly there was no lack of strong albums. Now, some of these albums did okay, especially okay considering the time. Some of them didn't do well at all. This is also the period where we're starting to see a lot of our favorite bands go from major labels down to minor labels. We'll get into all that, but we're going to do it chronologically. I'm going to let Matt start with his choices of 1992 albums that, held their own.
Right. 1992. I've got 5 picks from 1992, and I'm coming in hot on this one. So I've organized these all by relatively when they came out, according to Wikipedia. I had to look at all the dates. So all these came out in 1992. The first one, again, coming in hot, is Def Leppard Adrenalize. This one came out in March of 1992. And of course, Def Leppard, they were probably working a lot of this material before the term grunge even became a thing. So they were completely oblivious, I would say, to, you know, what was going on by the time this album came out. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about the history of each album, but just wanted to go through each one. So there's Def Leppard, Adrenalize. My next one is actually my favorite album by this band. This one came out in August 25 of 1992. It's Warrant's Dog Eat Dog. This is their third album. Kicks right off with Machine Gun, Hole in My Wall, April 2031. Man, I never get tired of this record. Andy Warhol was right. And then you've got the other songs like Bonfire and I think probably The Bitter Pill is one of my favorite all-time Warrant songs. So really strong, heavy album, not quite in the grunge vein at all on this record. It's still Warrant and they're still kicking butt and taking names. So the third one I wanted to talk about came out in September of 1992. This is Great White's Saco City. Another fairly heavy album that kicks off with this weird kind of conversation that's taped on a, you know, when you would actually get a phone message from somebody, it was recorded on tape. Yeah, some great songs on here. The Big Goodbye. Dr. Me's is a really super catchy tune. You'll probably be talking about a few of these, I would imagine. Got two more to show you for 1992. Extreme, Three Sides to Every Story. Obviously, that's their third album. This one came out in September of 1992 as well. I've heard a lot of people say this is their favorite Extreme album. I know someone that's on the TVC that's not a huge fan of this one, Will, but there you go. Extreme, Three Sides to Every Story. I remember, again, when this one came out, you know, completely really oblivious to the scene that was going on. And I remember seeing the video and thinking, wow, that's a pretty cheesy thing for Rest in Peace. When that video came out, I was like, wow, that's really cheesy for the times, but I kind of adore that thing now, but really obviously wasn't keeping with the times. And the last one for me for 1992, I know Tim's gonna talk about this one, came out in November. We saw them twice on this tour, Bon Jovi's really awesome album, and in my opinion, their last really great album. Wish I had this one on vinyl. Keep the Faith. That's it for me. 92.
Yeah. So I've got 4 albums to talk about from 92, 3 of which you've already talked about. First one is Warrant Dog Eat Dog. And, you know, I never liked Warrant until this album came out, as funny as that may seem. I wasn't on board with the first couple of records. Why? Well, why? I don't know. Maybe it was just hearing them a little bit too much, where other bands that I liked that I thought were better were not getting the attention. It was quite poppy, but over the years, I learned to appreciate, you know, the genius of the late Janie Lane's songwriting. I mean, in an era that's not known for songwriting, that man could write songs, write memorable songs. Yes, you know, they had Heaven, which was, you know, G, C, and D. It was your, you know, standard procedure for a hit power ballad, and it worked, went all the way to number 2. And of course, Cherry Pie, which Janie Lane himself regrettably regretted in a particularly poignant clip that I think we've all seen on VH1. But I love what they did with Dog Eat Dog. And like Matt intimated, they didn't go full on grunge. There was a little bit of grunge that would start to creep in with Ultraphobic, and really crept in on Belly to Belly, which oddly enough were not major label albums. What they did with Dog Eat Dog, which was still released on Columbia, they got producer Michael Wagner, who had just come off Skid Row's Slave to the Grind. And it's a much tougher sounding album than the Beau Hill production on the first 2 albums. I also believe it's the first album that Joey Allen plays all the guitars on, as opposed to having Mike Slamer play all the guitar parts and then teach it to the guys, which is a well-known, well-trodden story. But it's a really, really tough sounding album. And, you know, some of the song titles that Matt talked about should clue you into the fact that this is not Cherry Pie Part 2. Then again, even on Cherry Pie, you had songs like Uncle Tom's Cabin and that weren't exactly, yeah, you had Love in Stereo too, but, you know, they were off the beaten path, and Janie was attempting to write about slightly more serious things. They still put out a rockin' album that I think anybody could appreciate. This album actually managed to go gold, which is pretty admirable given the time period. But obviously, that was it for their major label run. And, Janie Lane has since sadly passed away, but a great record and one that's really worth looking back fondly on. Next one is another band like Warrant that I did not like at the time, at their heyday. Did not like them at all. That would be Great White Psycho City with their moving pictures inspired back cover. I had to throw that in. Yeah, this album, this was their last on Capitol Records. They had a very successful run leading up to this. Actually, this album came out pretty quickly on the heels of what might be my favorite Great White album, which is Hooked in early '90s. Yeah, I don't know for sure. I think got a lot of Great White albums I don't have, so some of them are hard to find. This is a good, solid album, very much. Even though they had just released an album like a year and a half before, very much oblivious to the times. But I think that's very admirable. And catchy songs, like you said, Step on You, Big Goodbye, Dr. Music, great song, Love is a Lie, great ballad. And yeah, it does start out with that really strange answering machine message that was directed at them. Somebody was not having a good day. Good album, Sunk Without a Trace, didn't certify. Even Hooked went gold by way of comparison, but this was it for their major label recording days, but a good solid album. Next one is an album that's related to the next album I'm going to talk about. This is Triumph Edge of Excess. Very maligned album, even by Triumph fans. Rick Emmett was not on this album, so you're missing his guitar playing and his vocals. Gilmore, the drummer, sings every song on here. Guitars are by a guy named Phil X, which he's gone on to great things. I personally think his guitar talents are going to waste. But anyway, this album comes out. And initially, it was getting a lot of airplay south of the border. But the record label they were on was called Victory Records, which was a division it was distributed by Polygram. It was a label formed by Phil Carson, who used to be with Atlantic. I mean, he signed AC/DC. And yes, we're also on this label. The label went defunct. So all support for the album gone. It didn't really have a chance to do anything. And the band themselves kind of get it in their head that this is not a good period. This is a good, solid hard rock album that came out at a time when I needed a good, solid hard rock album. So, and it's to this date, it's 30 years ago, it's still the last thing Triumph ever did for new music. And finally, yes, Matt nailed it. I am going to talk about Bon Jovi's Keep the Faith. I'm going to show this off. This is a 2 CD set that I still have unopened. It's got a disc of live stuff on the back, which is kind of cool.
Nice.
Now, this album, a lot of Bon Jovi fans, I would say, maybe got off the train after New Jersey and never got back on. I stuck around for this album, and I agree with Matt. This is their last good album from start to finish. They had a few good songs after this, but they were few and far between. And I'm not even talking about live performances. I'm talking about the excitement and the music they were making in the studio. They still delivered a good album. It was a slightly different album. Now, at the time, it probably didn't sound that different to non-fans, people that made up their mind they didn't like Bon Jovi in the first place. But the fact is, there is different material on here. There's R&B based stuff. There's blues based stuff. There's a couple songs that are quite heavy for Bon Jovi. There's epic material like Dry County. And yes, my first 2 concerts were Bon Jovi, both on this tour in February and December of 1993. Talked about it many times before. They still put out a good album. And like Def Leppard, they were still selling multi-millions. It's just that they were selling 3-4 million as opposed to 9-10 million. But yeah, still doing very, very well. And really, Bon Jovi, I almost hesitated to put them on here because they sort of rose above their peers and kind of don't even mention the fact of the era that they came out of, which kind of bothers me. But it's such a good album. It's worth mentioning. There was still standard good hard rock being released in 92 that didn't have any element of grunge whatsoever. It was still high fidelity production. It was still melodic vocals, melodic writing, guitar solos, you name it. So that's our list for 92. So now we're heading into 93. At this point, Matt and I were halfway through our first year at BCC. And so this will take us through the, first and second year. What do you got for 93 albums?
Yeah, so this one is actually, the one I'm going to start off with is could be my favorite album of this entire bunch. It's definitely one of my favorites of this band. Came out in February of '93. I remember this really well because February, it was like snowstorm time in Canada. And I remember going across the border and buying of course, I had bought the cassette at the time of this one. This is Poison's Native Tongue. And I know a lot of Poison fans kind of looked down on this record. They didn't really like the single that came out, Stand, which I have the CD single for that actually. At any given time, that's actually been my kind of quote unquote favorite Poison album of the time. I listened to that one constantly in the 90s. So yeah, I really loved Native Tongue. The next one I'm going to show you, I bought as soon as it came out. It took a really long time for me to warm up to it, but I think it's fair to include it because I love this band and I do love this record now. And it's got a really cool kind of one of my first jewel cases that was like this multicolored kind of thing. This is Living Color Stain that came out in March of 1993. The big songs off of this one, there's a song, track 8, called Nothingness. Oh man, one of my favorite kind of melancholy kind of songs with a really good bass groove to it. It's very much alternative, I would say, compared to like their first 2 records, but they are dealing with topics like bisexuality and drug use, and getting into a little more mature stuff on this record. So actually, I forgot to mention it. For 1993, I have 4, so that's the first 2. The next one, again, I've said at certain points, this one might be my favorite album by this band at any given time. Winger's Pull from May 18th of 1993. Pretty sure this one came and sunk without a trace. Tim, you can probably talk about this one. I'm sure you've got it on your list. Blind Revolution Man, Down Incognito, Junkyard Dog in brackets, Tears Falling on Stone. Wow, man, I love this record. And the very last track, Who's the One, number 10. I can't tell you how many times I've sat down and played that on acoustic guitar. So yeah, that's my list for 1993.
I actually have 5 from '93, which is the most of any of these years. First one is Poison, Native Tongue, and a band that I grew to appreciate much more as the years went on. I actually did a Contrarians episode where I argued that this is the best Poison album, and I still stand by that. It's no pun intended. It's strong album all the way through. Obviously the combination of Richie Kotzen and the rest of the band wasn't destined to last, but while it did, they put out a quality album, and it managed to go, I think, gold in the States. I think it went platinum in Canada, and Stand actually was a top 20 single here in Canada. So they were still doing okay at this point, and no grunge whatsoever on this album. And I think if people talk about being a darker album, it's strictly a visual thing. There's no bright neon green on this one. They're still using the logo, but it's a more serious album for them, even though there's still songs on it like Body Talk and Strike Up the Band. It's just good, solid rock and roll. Next one, I'm kind of cheating a little bit because it's very 70s. In one case, maybe almost 60s, but it was a new combo in '93, in spring '93 when this came out. Coverdale Page, the one album, the combination of David Coverdale and Jimmy Page. Some said this was merely done so Jimmy could stick it to Robert Plant about not wanting to do a Zeppelin reunion, which is why the Page Plant thing happened the following year. This album only went gold. It was a few years too late. You talk about oblivious to trends. David Coverdale and Jimmy Page are not going to be swayed by a bunch of guys from Seattle wearing flannel. But it's essentially a Whitesnake album. I mean, it sounds like Whitesnake with Jimmy Page on guitar. Great songs. I know a lot of people laughed at Pride and Joy when it first came out. I still love it. It's a quirky little song. It's got a weird drum beat. Shake My Tree, awesome opener, beautiful acoustic guitar in it. It still has that production, that production that I just love. It's the, Mike Fraser, co-produced and engineered the album. So it's from that Bob Rock school of big, heavy drums. So out of place sounding in '93. Loved it. Still love it. Sunk Like a Stone. They only toured a little bit in Japan. They never toured behind it. Might have made a difference if they did. Next up is one Matt also already mentioned, the much maligned Winger, Pull, and stupid Beavis and Butthead crap. Like, whatever. This is a strong, solid album. Even the ballads, Spell I'm Under and The Lucky One, are dark, and they're not fluffy. The band sounds fantastic on this. Was produced by the late Mike Shipley. So he came from a little bit of the Mutt Lange school, even though it doesn't sound like a Mutt Lange album. You can just hear the hard work that went into this with crafting smart, solid songs that you get in your head. And this was the last thing they did for 13 years. I mean, really, they kind of did well. They just ducked and ran because, the Winger just became a byword for uncool, unfortunately. And I was always like, well, what's wrong with good musicianship? So yeah, it didn't certify. I think it only went to number 85 in the charts. And although, I mean, I do remember seeing Down Incognito and Much Music a couple of times. Like, there was that weird transitional period. Like, do we play the stuff? Do we not? But yeah. Next up is a band that I don't talk about nearly enough on here. I kind of forget about them because they're not very good at promoting themselves. Canadian band, Harem Scarum.
Okay.
This is their second album, Mood Swings. This came out in the summer of '93. I thought that their first album was pretty decent. Talked about that on our 1991 episode. I still think this is their best album from start to finish. It's a little heavier than the first album. There are real drums on it. And this runs the gamut. I mean, it's got heavy stuff like Saviors Never Cry. It's got like mid-tempo stuff like Jealousy, Stranger Than Love. Great ballads like If There Was a Time. Sentimental Boulevard's a great mid-tempo song that actually Darren Smith, the drummer, sings, sounding a little bit like Paul Stanley, oddly enough. And great guitar work from Pete Lesperance, who's sort of like the Nuno of Canada. Yeah, these guys were too late out of the gates, I think. If they'd have come out in 87, 88 might have been a difference. They didn't come out until 91. They were never signed to a US label. It was Warner in Canada, but this remains a great album. They actually redid it, called it Mood Swings 2. I don't even have that one. I don't think you can better the original. Another band totally out of time. Oddly enough, Geffen Records, they're the label that brought Whitesnake back, that brought Aerosmith back, that introduced the world to Guns N' Roses, but they also introduced the world to Nirvana. But there were still acts on Geffen like Coverdale Page and related former Whitesnake, John Sykes, with the long-awaited follow-up to the debut Blue Murder album. Took way too long to come out, and the only other album they did came out late '93, Died Without a Trace, Nothing But Trouble. I happened to get mine because Columbia House had it. It's not as good as the first album, but it's still got about half of it, I think, could stand toe-to-toe with the songs on that first album. They got a different lineup at this point. Carmine Appice and Tony Franklin are credited on here, but we really don't know who played on what. Great vocals from John Sykes. Couldn't have been more out of time. Those are my choices from 1993.
That's awesome, Tim. And I'm actually kicking myself for not having Harem Scarum on my list. I own that album and actually got it signed by Harry Hess, a few years later. I actually forgot to mention in the intro, so while we've organized this by year, Tim and I also constrained ourselves to coming up with 20 in total and spreading them out over these years. The reason I'm mentioning that now is because there's quite a few awesome records that I'm sure people know that we might have had on our list that, like, for example, Faith No More. A few bands I stayed away from on my list just because they were kind of in the, I don't know why zeitgeist is the right word, but their kind of music they were making was right for that time. Whereas the stuff that we're mostly talking about was, the bands that were considered sort of out of time. So, had I included Faith No More, 3 of their records would have been on this list. Had I included Metallica or Slick Toxic or actually quite a few of the 70s bands like Alice Cooper, Aerosmith, Van Halen, Kiss, and Ozzy Osbourne. Love tons of those albums from the 90s, but I haven't included any of those on my own list just to try and get it down to 20. So we're moving on to 1994. Oh man, I actually realized one that I forgot to show for 1993.
That's all right. Start off with that.
What's that?
Just
Oh
that's
yeah.
okay. Start off with it.
Okay. I don't know if this is if this even technically counts, but for 1993, I also had Def Leppard's Retroactive. I mean, it's not all new studio material, but I remember this being a really huge record for us when it came out. So yeah, just realized I forgot to add that one. Okay, moving on to 1994. We're going to kick this one off with, I think, an album that Tim has talked about on the Contrarians. In March 15th, 1994, the self-titled album from Motley Crue with their new lead singer, John Corabi. The next one on my list is a completely different kind of album. Talking about Great White again, and this one came out in May. I didn't actually buy this one when it came out. I kind of fell out of touch with Great White for a while, and I'm glad I've gone back. But this is Great White's Sail Away. The version I have here actually has the main Sail Away album, and then it has an Anaheim Live kind of set on the second CD. So Sail Away came out in May 10th, 1994. Another really awesome band, Queensryche's Promised Land. This one came out in October of 1994. I think I bought the cassette for this when it came out. This one does have a little bit of the, I don't want to say grunge, but some more alternative and some darker, definitely darker themes coming off of Empire for sure. But Bridge and I Am I and Damaged and Disconnected. Yeah, this is a really, really cool album. So that's my list for 1994.
Cool. Okay, so I've got three for 1994. One of which you've already seen, although it's a different color. It's a Motley Crue album, self-titled. Matt says yellow, mine's red. This is actually the first thing I ever bought by Motley Crue. Yes, I did argue for this on the Contrarians. I stand by that. This is a solid album. Maybe it doesn't sound like Motley Crue, although I think it does. You got Tommy's drums and Nick's guitar. It just does. And it sounds like Nicky's songwriting to me. But yeah, the vocals are so very different. It's still a great hard rock album. Managed to go gold. But, you know, considering they were coming off a 5 million seller with Dr. Feelgood and even a double platinum seller with Decade of Decadence, a best of, it sunk well below expectations. And this hit the delete bins within the year, unfortunately, but still a great album, still worth checking out. Even if you don't think you like Motley Crue, I think it's pretty safe. You could probably get to this one. Next one, two albums that I kind of in my mind put in the same category. They came out right around the same time. Both bands that came out the same year, and one did surprisingly well. One nothing at all. First one is Cinderella's fourth album, and still to this day, final album, Still Climbing. This album, unfortunately, just had no promotion whatsoever. It was a long time coming. It had been 4 years since Heartbreak Station. You know, they were up for air in 92 because somehow they managed to get the song Hot and Bothered on the Wayne's World soundtrack, which they put on the end. They kind of stuck on the end of here, but every bit as good as the other three albums. I mean, Tom Kiefer just didn't phone in an album. He just has strong, consistent songwriting all the way through. Well produced. There's nothing dated sounding about the production. He was having major issues with his voice, but he managed to get out a good studio performance here. But just nothing happened with this album. It disappeared from, the fact that I've actually got a Canadian retail copy of this is astounding to me, because this, is typically you'd have to get it from Columbia House, and then it was big time deleted, and you'd have to get an import. But yeah, unfortunately, this did not succeed. Now, oddly enough, the next one I'm going to talk about did. This is Tesla with the album Busted Nut, which in 1994, there's a nutcracker on here. That expression had not come into popular usage, at least not in this area. But anyway, this album came out in fall of 1994 and somehow managed to go gold, which blows my mind because it's nowhere near as good as Still Climbing. It's not bad, but there's just nothing. It doesn't sound with the times at all. Not that Cinderella does, but How they managed to sell 500,000 copies in the States, I have no idea. Geffen obviously pushed this album a little bit more than Mercury pushed the Cinderella album. Nothing on this album was a hit in any way, shape, or form. I remember the song Mama's Fool was on an MCA sampler disc, didn't get any airplay at the radio station I worked at, but that's how I knew they were back. And, you know, there are some songs from here that I just don't like at all, like Try So Hard. That's one of the worst choruses I've ever heard in my life. I don't know why they found the need to do a version of Games People Play by Joe South. But anyway, you know, there's some good songs on here. Action Talks is a good heavy one. They got a couple good ballads, Need Your Love and A Lot to Lose. Cry is a good heavy one, actually. She Wants, a fun one. But yeah, it wasn't their time anymore. And they went on hiatus after this too. But like I said, I can't believe this album went gold. I think it's out of print now, but there you go. That's mine. That's my list from 1994.
Right on. I actually had that again. I don't know how I missed this, but I had Cinderella was actually on my list too. So love that record. Now we're on to 1995, and I've got 4 for 1995. The first one I want to show you is another album by Warrant. So this is the follow-up to Dog Eat Dog. This one came out in March of 1995. This one does lean a little bit on the grunge stylings as far as like some of the vocal effects and some of the wah-wah guitar effects and you know, the production stuff is a little bit grungy, but the songwriting is still there. You know, the song Undertow and Follow, the themes he's talking about is stuff he's been talking about and writing about all along. And I think actually the last song on here, Stronger Now, is one of the sweetest and best ballads and one of the best things that Janie's ever written. So that was Warrant's Ultraphobic. The next one is an EP by Steve Vai, came out in March of 1995. This is Alien Love Secrets, an absolutely killer album. It's got 7 tracks on it. I'm pretty sure the reason he did that is so that he can fit the 7th song, which is traditionally a ballad on a Steve Vai album. So that would be Tender Surrender. Got 2 more to show you for 1995. This next one was a hard one to take in at first. This is definitely one of my favorite bands at the time, following some trends, but not really following the grunge trend, more following bands like Pantera. Is that a Skid Row? Yeah, Skid Row, Subhuman Race. This one came out in March of, actually, I'm just realizing now, all 3 of these that I've shown came out in March. So it was quite a lot of things to buy at that time. Didn't really love this when it came out. I really like this now. It's got some really thick production. I did manage to find, I actually wanted to show you, this is like the one of the first digipacks that I've ever owned. And, you know, a case why I don't really love digipacks. I really take care of my stuff, but you know, they just don't wear very well. So I did actually manage to find the jewel case version of that eventually, and thought I would pick it up. But yeah, Skid Row, Subhuman Race. Took me a long time to get into that record. The final one I want to talk about for 1995 is probably my favorite album by this band. It's Slaughter's Fear No Evil. A lot of people talk about their first and second records. I love those too. This one came out in May of 1995. I actually saw them live on this tour. I just wanted to show you inside. Here's the CD. I might have to pull the, yeah, just give me one sec, pull the tray out. I managed to meet most of the members of Slaughter on this tour. After their set, there was a break between, I think it was Slaughter opened up, and then it was Warrant coming on, and then Vince Neil solo band was headlining the show. And between sets, we went outside, and I met Mark Slaughter. He was just standing around eating a hot dog from like a vendor outside the venue, and talked to him for a little bit. He was really, really nice, and got a few of the guys to sign my CD. So that was pretty cool for me in 1995.
Yeah. Yeah, and the fact that, I mean, this is when, you know, a lot of these bands like Warren and Slaughter were both down to a label called CMC International. Yeah. So to show up at one of their gigs, actually having one of their new albums, I'm sure meant a lot to these guys to, you know, these fans were hanging on. So I've got Is that it for your 95, Matt?
In 1995.
So I've got 3 from 95. And the fun thing is this year, there's none of them are the same. The
Oh,
first one
awesome.
is the last that I've done a Contrarians episode. It hasn't been that long, actually. It's Dawkins Dysfunctional. And an
Okay.
aptly named record. I still think this is a really strong album. There are elements of slightly heavier music in here and some down tuning, but they didn't. It still sounds a lot like Doc, and there's still great guitar solos on it from George Lynch. The next one, Shadow Life. If we ever do an episode on absolute worst albums in my collection, that'll be near the top. It's a piece of crap, but yeah, Dysfunctional. All anyone needs to do to see what I think about it is see the Contrarians episode. This was on Columbia, still a major label band. One more time. The next one is a band I forget about. One of the glut of bands that came out that Atlantic Records signed. There were too many bands when grunge hit. I will agree with that. There were just too many bands doing basically the same thing. And between them all, maybe they had 1 or 2 really good songs. And that, so there was the economy was flooded. And I remember for 2-3 years after that, you could find all of these CDs marked down everywhere, whether it was Baton Rouge or, all these types of bands. Well, one of the bands that put an album out in 91 on a major label on Atlantic was a band called Tattoo Rodeo. Now, their first album was charmingly titled Rode Hard, Put Away Wet, which might give you the impression that they were sort of like I don't know, maybe like a Guns N' Roses type of band. They really weren't. They were kind of not Southern rock, definitely hard rock, but kind of a Cinderella type of thing, maybe, although they still had keyboards. It's an okay album. But when they really impressed me, I happened to find this at Digital World in like 96. This album, it's got 9 songs on it. It's called Skin. And this actually came out on Mausoleum Records, which is like a really heavy metal label. It's distributed by EMI. The copy I have, it's a Canadian label. This is a good modern Southern rock, but heavy Southern rock album. Great vocals by a guy named Dennis Churchill Dries. None of these guys were well known in any capacity. I just listened to this yesterday, and I still think it really holds up well for just an independent release. It's well produced, I wanted to give this a little shout out. It came out sometime in 1995. I'm not sure when. And then this album, which I'm going to put in the out of nowhere category. This is Night Ranger.
Oh.
The album is called Feeding Off the Mojo. Very strange title. Now, of course, in the early to mid 90s, Jack Blades of Night Ranger was doing well as a member of Damn Yankees. They actually kind of bucked the trend and had like a double platinum album and then a gold follow-up. And then they sort of, they were a super group, so they went their separate ways. But Kelly Keagy, drummer and co-lead vocalist, and guitarist Brad Gillis continued with a version of Night Ranger. They got a bass player and vocalist named Gary Moon, who kind of has a raspy Tom Kiefer-ish sort of voice. They put this album out on an independent label called Drive. This came out sometime in 95, and this is a really good melodic rock album. The songs that Kelly Keagy sings sounds like Night Ranger. The songs that Gary Moon sings doesn't sound like Night Ranger at all. You're almost got a Motley Crue type situation where because the vocalists are so different, you would never know that it was the same band. Well produced. Of course, it didn't do anything, but it set the stage for the original band to reunite a couple of years later. But yeah, a forgotten album no one ever talks about, and it came up sometime in 95. I think it was towards the end of the year. That's what I've got from 95.
Awesome. Well, we're really winding down on our piles here. So again, Tim and I tried to constrict this to only 20 albums, and I only have 3 left to show you, 2 in 96 and 1 in 97. So 1996, Steve Vai put out his, what do you call this, his magnum opus, his epic record.
Yeah, I would.
Fire Garden. Came out September 17th, 1996. It's got 2 phases. Wow, there's like 18 different tracks. Of course, John Kalodner is involved still. And this is, I think, the first album I ever ordered online, back when web crawler was the main search engine, if you can, anyone old enough to remember that. So that's Steve Vai's Fire Garden. Tim, you have this one as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great. He sings half of it. Yeah.
And then the last one I want to show you in 1996. So I'm gonna slot this in weirdly. I'm pretty sure this was recorded in 1994. It didn't actually come out until 2000, but I talked to Tim about this earlier, and really this album was supposed to come out in 1996.
Yeah.
Poison's Crack a Smile, uh, and more, because they've added some of the MTV Unplugged stuff on at the end of it. We had a bootleg of this for years, and I actually remember designing a really bad cover for it, but I downloaded it. I haven't really been into downloading now, but back then it was all the rage, find a bootleg of an album, download it, make your own CD. I was really glad when this one officially actually came out in 2000. Obviously took way too long to come out, but we'd heard a few of these songs on one of their greatest hits albums, Tim, that came out.
Yeah, a couple of them. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, 1996, Poison, Crack a Smile, and more.
In that case, it wasn't like you were downloading something that you could have bought.
Yes.
So it was really cool. There was that one, and then of course there was Kiss Carnival of Souls, which is like, we want to hear this. So yeah, they took a long time with the Poison one. It's a great album. I love the tune. I love CC DeVille to death, and he is Poison's guitar player. But I love the two albums with the other guitar players. I like the fact that they're in the catalog. Okay, so first one is not a hair band, even though, no, not a hair band, but definitely a band that came out in the 80s. And I've never done a Contrarians episode on this, but if I ever did, this could be my favorite album, Metallica.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I love this as Load. As a fan, this was the first new album I really waited for to come out. This came out in June 4th, 1996. Now, a lot of people hated this album, and I think more than anything, what they were hating is the fact that this band cut their hair, which shouldn't have anything to do with anything. This CD has been like, the case to this is very scratched up. This has had a lot of plays for me. I love the logo. Like they took the M in Metallica and made a ninja star out of it. And, for a while they weren't using their actual logo. I think that kind of put people off. This is a dark album. There are elements of alt rock, especially in the first single until it sleeps. There's a little bit of Southern rock and things like Poor Twisted Me and Ronnie. It's a long album, maybe a little bit too long, but 2x4, Wasting My Hate, King Nothing. I love this album. I've never had a problem with this album. And to me, this proved that you could still go out as a band from the 80s, sell out arenas, and actually have some hit singles, and put out a quality album. Yeah, I've never had a problem with Load. That's my first one from 1996. My second one is a band that was sort of late to the party. The first album came out in 89. Weren't exactly a hair metal band, more of a super group, but this is Mr. Big's fourth album called Hey Man, a man made out of hay. This is a Columbia House issue on Atlantic. It didn't do anything, After they had a big hit single with To Be With You, all the record company wanted was the acoustic song. So they heard Cat Stevens' Wild World. I got a little bit of play on their third album, but that didn't do anything. They went from having like a double platinum album to one that sold about 150,000 copies. That's just how quickly, in some cases, the grunge thing took over. This was the follow-up, didn't come out for 3 years later, 96. I think it's a solid album. There's some heavy songs on here, great melodic songs, like Take Cover, the second song on here. Was a big hit in Japan. They always did well in Japan. It might be my, if Lean Into It is their best album, this might be my second favorite album by Mr. Big, just a good solid record from start to finish. That's my 1996 albums.
Awesome. Now we're into 1997, which I put that as a cutoff because I think this is sort of really when grunge was really in the decline. Now we're also getting like post-grunge bands, and a lot of the sort of hair bands are actually, they've gone through their grunge period, and now they're putting out music that's a little bit more similar to what they would have done before. Anyway, I only want to show you one more record that came out in 1997. This is Slaughter's Revolution, came out in May of 1997. The first song's American Pie. The song on here called Tongue and Groove. Let me put my tongue in your groove. Yeah.
They do about laying down floor. It's about flooring.
Yeah, exactly. This one I find fairly similar to their last album, but it's It's really good. It's actually probably, I think, their last really good album. It's got the original members of the band before Tim Kelly had passed away, and they do a cover of Rocky Mountain Way on here. Really, really good version. So this one again came out on CMC International. I see I've got like a BMG music copy of that one.
Cool. So I've got three from 97 to finish up. Now, none of these bands were actually considered hair bands. It's just the era they came out of. First one's a band that Matt already talked about. This is Queensryche. This is their 1997 album, Here in the Now Frontier. This album did not go gold, didn't certify. I think it's one of my favorites by them. This came out in early 1997. Hugh Syme artwork, of course. And although I liked Promised Land, and it did well, it was a platinum album, and they still did well as touring act. This was their last album for EMI, and this album did not certify. And it's Promised Land kind of had a dry production on it. This one has an even drier production on it. I think this album was once again produced by Peter Collins, but I better check to make sure. Yeah. So it does kind of pick up where Promised Land left off. It is very dry, not a lot of reverb on the drums. I think there are tons of good songs on here. The Voice Inside, Saved, You. Now, they are getting into that grunge alternative thing of one-word song titles, Spool, Reach, Hero. But I don't know, I dug this album. This is another one where I can see the jewel case and the light is well scuffed up. So, even though Queensryche were never a hair band, they certainly came out in that era. And they were still making great music, even if most people had stopped paying attention. At this point, you could still look forward to a new Queensryche album and pretty much figure it was going to be all right. The next one, not a hair band by any stretch. They did come out in 1989 with their first album, but there's a strange hair metal connection on this one. A lot of diehard fans don't like this one at all. They prefer the demos. I like this album, Dream Theater, Falling into Infinity. This came out in the fall of 97. It was 3 years after their previous album, Awake. A lot of record company pressure on this one. Desmond Child actually co-writes a song on here called You Not Me, which does give it a slightly more, at least old school commercial feel. Wasn't a big song. Other than that, it's typical Dream Theater. Great prog, produced by Kevin Shirley. So it's got this dead sounding snare drum sound. I have never been a fan of his production style. He's worked with a lot of bands I love, and I don't know what he does. Turn the snare up.
I agree.
When you hit it, not boom, boom. I don't know. He manages to deaden snares everywhere. And yeah, but despite that, I still really like this album. Listen to it a ton. And it's one of my favorite Dream Theater albums. Don't think it's my favorite. But basically a band that showed it was still possible to make melodic, chops-oriented rock with choruses that you can remember, even if they were on the prog side. And the final one I'm going to show you, I'm cheating a little bit because technically this is a band that started in the 70s, but I think most people, if they know about them at all, think of them as an 80s band. It's Y&T and Endangered Species, looking not unlike the Eat 'Em and Smile album cover. So Y&T, of course, after the 10 album in 1990, which I have argued for my favorite by them, they split up. And about 4 years later, they reunited and they put out a couple of independent albums. They put out Musically Incorrect in 95, and then this one in 97. And then it was another 13 years before they put out Face Melter. Still not a lot of new music. Both of those albums were really good. I picked this one because I didn't have that many from 97. And this one's a little bit more traditional Y&T sounding. It's not quite as down-tuned. And, I just think it's a good, solid album from start to finish. Now, this one, there was CMC, but then there was also another label called D Rock Records, D small E Rock Records. That's the label this came out on in North America. This is a UK copy on Music for Nations, which is a big independent label, which I think eventually morphed into a label called Dreamcatcher. But yeah, solid hard rock albums that came out in a period where there was supposedly no more room and no more fans of that stuff. Well, we've just shown you that there were. And, and I'm not, here's the thing, I'm not bad mouthing, it doesn't do any good for me to come out and bad mouth groups. Even though I was never a fan of Nirvana or Smashing Pumpkins or you name it, I was never a fan of that whole scene. A lot of people were, and I never had a problem with that. What I had a problem with was the Why can't you be, you were listening to Poison and more a year ago. What happened? What happened to you?
Yeah.
Not what happened to music. What happened to you? Were you lying to yourself, or are you just going along with the trends? And I also think the fashion was ridiculous. The flannel, the dressing down, the not that I ever dressed like any of the glam bands, but I don't know. It's hard. We've had this discussion with Will, because Will's so much younger. He didn't live through it. Let me tell you, it was very real. I can only imagine that the closest equivalent would be if you were a really diehard fan of disco, when the disco backlash happened, and it's like all of a sudden these bands could not get arrested and weren't played on the radio anymore. But again, that didn't even happen overnight. That took a few years. So yeah, it was a fascinating time to be a young person, and especially with me with working in radio, it was a fascinating time. But if the mainstream was any indication, there was none of this stuff would have existed. You had to search for it. And for the first half of this time period, I didn't have access to the internet, so it was hard to search for it. So is anybody out there with us on this? Not that you have to be, but what albums did we miss? Are there any albums that you would have mentioned? Like I said, we did limit it to 20 each, because this would have been like a 3-hour episode if not. Yeah, what are some other albums that you think are really deserving of a mention on here? And some bands, maybe some bands that we didn't get to. So that's this episode of Tim's Vinyl Confessions. Matt, thanks a lot for the idea. I think this was a great discussion. This ought to get us some hate mail. So yeah, join us again next week for another edition of Tim's Vinyl Confessions. Until then, go listen to some mid-90s hard rock.